This track leads up to a viewpoint between the villages of Hamatobo and Hamakosi. And we're looking now across the Matawa Valley to the village of Hamama, named after the principal chief of the area, Chief Mama, the first principal chief who died in 1924. It's also the village of Memaseso, and also it has a high school, rather remote high school because it doesn't have electricity laid on, rather a poor water supply, but it's got devoted teachers and it has a good standard, and we've sponsored a number of children there over the years. And as we go up the cliff to the skyline, we see Tabatelle. That's actually a mountain I haven't climbed. I've been to the base of the summit, but it's a technical rock climb to get to the top. If we move round now to the left, there are other villages like Hakwidi, which are on top of the cliff. And eventually we get round to a large mountain, which is the Popa Mountain itself, which gives its name to the area. And Poponyani, which means small Popa. And then next we see in the distance Tabana di Mele, the mountains which look like breasts, and in fact that is what the Sesotho name means. We finally reach Kaba, flat-top mountain behind the plateau in the foreground. Well, here is the moon. Actually, Sumitra's not with me at the moment, but I've learned from her that one of the names of the moon in her language, or at least in Sanskrit, is the rabbit carrier. And if you look very carefully, you can see in the moon, on the left, a head of a rabbit with its two ears sticking up. I was walking along this path one day in the winter of 1974. And, well, I was looking at the scenery. I wasn't really expecting to find anything very special, least of all fossil footprints. People had told me, there's no fossil footprints in Roma. They're in other parts of Lesotho. But then I came across this slab, and I looked, and sure enough, there were fossil footprints. And in fact, this has become one of the better known sites in Lesotho. In fact, it actually results from something like 190 million years ago, there being a shallow lake on the left of me, and a sloping bank of sand, more or less sloping as it is now. And there were animals, quite a lot of animals around, and the ones which were in the water were somehow scared, and they were more happy on the land, and they ran up the slope. So the footprints filled up, the ones at the bottom filled up with water. As they go higher up, they get shallower. There's another track here, and they get shallower as they go up. And then, along here, although it's difficult to see it, but I'm going to walk backwards along it, I'm stepping on the footprints. There's actually a track going right along here of an animal which was not scared, so it was walking slowly along the surface of the sandbank. At the end of the day, probably, just as it happens in Lesotho today, there was a tremendous sandstorm, or dust storm. And it was very much as it is today. We talk about Free State rain. That's heavy rain, just a few drops, which dampen the dust. And indeed, you can actually see on the surface of the sandstone the pits made by the rain, or perhaps the hail. And shortly afterwards, they were probably covered up by the dust of the sandstorm to remain covered for most of the next 190 million years. Now they're exposed. After we found the first fossil footprint site, we started looking for others. And indeed, there are many in the Roma Valley. There's even one 2 or 3 minutes walk from our house on the campus, which nobody had noticed. A small one. Where I'm standing here now is on an ordinary track, but not quite so ordinary, because if you look carefully enough, there are things to be discovered. And now let's have a look. Yes, you can see it's another fossil footprint, similar to the others, complete with the nails, and there it is lying under the road, covered up with the dust. It's now time for us to make a tour of the Roma campus, and perhaps we should start here at the primary school, which is now also a high school. This is the original primary school building that was, I think the school was opened in 1966. Our son attended it in the late 1970s and early 1980s. This is the foundation stone of the main university administration block. It dates back to Pius XII College, and of course it's written in Latin. I think I can remember enough Latin to translate. This stone was blessed by the Reverend Father Leo de Châtelet, OMI. He was, I think, Canadian. Anyway, he was head of the Oblates, Superior General, as it says here, and the date is December April, the 4th month of 1952, in honor of the Blessed Virgin Mary Immaculate. We are standing now in Oppenheimer Hall. There have been many donors to the university, and amongst them have been the mining company, Anglo-American Corporation, and the person who was instrumental in finding funds for this building was the late Harry Oppenheimer. I think my wife and myself may be the last people here who were present on that occasion and are still here. Possibly some people who are now staff were students at that time also. On the staff at that time, and I remember in the audience, was Desmond Tutu. He was a lecturer in theology at the university. He, of course, has distinguished himself as a Nobel laureate later, and as Archbishop of Cape Town, and as a fearless and tireless fighter against apartheid. He's somebody we were very privileged to be associated with in his time at the university. Of course, in those days, it was the University of Botswana, Lesotho and Swaziland, and naturally, the university honoured the donor by naming this Oppenheimer Hall. Well, I haven't been able to find a very good picture of the opening of Oppenheimer Hall, but we do have this one which shows the audience, and this contains in the front rows many of my former colleagues. Indeed, there's me, looking somewhat younger and with rather more hair. I'm sitting next to Father Cabon. He's half off the picture with his very extraordinary academic dress. Here is B.C. Marumo, who went to the Botswana campus eventually. This, in fact, is Desmond Tutu. He was on the staff in those days. Now, if we look in the second row here, there is Sheila Willett. I collaborated with her on the bibliographic work. Lucas Smits, a geographer, rock art specialist. Here is the late Professor Sam Guma, who became the Vice-Chancellor in Swaziland, John Tekateka, and then Professor Selby Hobo, also unfortunately no longer with us. Yes, well, this picture I took in 1965 when they were constructing the chapel, and to take it I climbed to the top where the cross was going to be. It shows a view across the campus. Here's the refectory block, course, all this area is now enclosed with buildings. And here's the science block. And in between, there's the remains of, I think, Brother Lambert, who was a great builder and landscaper of Pius XII College. He laid out this portion in the shape of a Union Jack. Of course, Lesotho was still then a British colony. Well, this is an old aerial photograph of the campus when it was still Pius XII College. In fact, what you can see here, Gilboa Hall is being under construction. Here is the refectory block, here is the science block, and here is the main administration block. And here's the campus housing. In fact, there's our house, there, with the little house in the garden beside it. The road, of course, in those days was just a dirt road. There was absolutely almost nothing. There was just Hamatoko here, small village, but Mafeking was mainly undeveloped. Toteng is now here, wasn't there. Hatabut is now here, it wasn't there. And indeed, to find a village, you've got to go all the way along the road, plus past the Roma mission to Hamafrifwani, which was actually very much smaller in those days. There's the hospital, the old hospital, the new hospital hadn't been built. Our Lady's House, Christ the King, Roma Primary School, I think, was mainly across the road at that point. And here we've got St. Augustine's and the Oblate Scholastic still under construction. Roma Plateau, right above the institutions. When the Catholic College was transferred to the British government to become UBBS in 1964, there was an agreement that only part of the land would be transferred and a section would be reserved for continuing Catholic use. This strip is known as Pius XII College House, and it includes the chapel that you see here, which was constructed about 1965, and more recently the buildings with the green roofs in the background have been constructed on this strip as student hostels administered by the Catholic Church. We are now at the Institute of Education, which shares its buildings with the Institute of Southern African Studies. I've been associated with both institutes. I was head of the Documentation and Publications Division of the Institute of Southern African Studies from 1981 to 85. In 89, I was very fortunate to be allowed to join the Institute of Education, where I have been ever since. They've allowed me quite a lot of flexibility in what I do, and I've had some very pleasant colleagues to work with. I'd like to introduce to you here my director, Dr. Sam Motlonela, and he's a man of many parts. He comes from one of the remotest parts of Lesotho, Sehlabatebe. He's a skilled horseman who's able to ride through the Maluti to visit his relatives and friends. He's also a skilled dairy farmer, and the university actually bought their Friesland cattle from him. But despite all that, he's a very busy and active academic. And he also, of course, is an administrator, because we've chosen him and he's done it very well to be our director for the past few years. Well, Sam, would you like to say a few words?
Okay. Thank you, Professor Ambrose. We have had Professor Ambrose with us for quite a long time. He's one of those outstanding scholars, in the sense that by training and academic background, he's a mathematician. But really, when you read some of the work that he has done in terms of history, geography, social work, etc., Professor Ambrose is very, very, very outstanding. In fact, I always say Professor Ambrose is a living example of people who are able to use literacy to learn things that they didn't learn at school. And it has been a pleasure for me to work with Professor Ambrose. Professor Ambrose, you have been a very, very outstanding scholar.
Well, thank you very much.
I enjoyed working with you.
Thank you very much for those words, which rather embarrass me because I think I'm a little less than I've been made out to be. But it is true that Lesotho has given me an opportunity to do many things which have been interesting to do. And if I hadn't had a base in the university, and in particular in the Institute of Education, I wouldn't have been able to do them. This is more or less the way the library looked when I came to the campus. This is the first stage of what became the Thomas Mafolo Library. It was built by a Portuguese contractor and by very labour-intensive methods. For example, the concrete was mixed and it was then taken by wheelbarrow up this ramp to lay the second story. I think it took about 3 years before it was finally opened. This particular building was under construction when I came in 1965 and it was finished in 1966. It's one of 3 buildings now which have finally expanded the library. There was a second part built in the 1970s, and there's a third part which you'll see something of perhaps, which is under construction but nearly complete. I'm sitting on the top of the roof of the second part of the university library, the part that was built in the late 1970s. And behind me you can see a piece of the roof of the third section, which is still under construction but will be open later this year, 2006. Beyond the botanical garden are the science blocks. There's an old one which was built about 1958 to 9, a newer one which was built about 10 years ago, and where the blue crane is, you can actually see it, the new science addition which will be for the Faculty of Health Sciences and the Faculty of Agriculture.
Standing in front of what was a plant physiology lab and biochemistry lab. This is mostly where I used to do my practical works. And if you look upstairs, there's a much bigger practical room which was meant for first and second years. And much of my activity also was connected to the botanical garden here and the old greenhouse. We are now in the herbarium of the National University of Lesotho, where I often come to identify collections that come to me from all over the place. And here is one of them, which I haven't identified yet. It was collected by us, and it's a very interesting flower head. You see many flowers together, stuck in a head. When the plants come here, of course, they are all fresh, but the identification takes a long time, and we have to have a record. So what is done is that the plants are pressed and dried in gradual stages so that their shape remains intact. This was the library during Pius XII college days, and later on it passed on to the Department of Physics. And when new extensions were built, physics moved to the extension and biology got this room, which is ideal really for a herbarium because it's very spacious and there's a lot of working space, and it's like a library of plants. So if people come with problems or questions, they can be referred to certain herbarium sheets, which they can then use for identifying what they are looking for. I come here, I've been given permission by the then head of department when I retired that I could always come and use the herbarium. And people here have been very cooperative and very helpful. So I've done quite a bit of work here after retiring.
This is one of the many classrooms in which I taught. I see it's now got a squeaky door. I used to come round with an oil can and actually oil the doors of the classes where I taught. In those days we used to have blackboards. Now modern technology has replaced them with whiteboards. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same as it was. This is inside the Talukdar building. This is the Senate room of the university. I've spent many hours in meetings here, must be hundreds if not thousands of hours. And on the wall of the room are the portraits of the chancellors of the university. Yes, on the left is the portrait of the first chancellor of the university, Sir Hugh Southern Stevenson, who was the High Commissioner for South Africa. And that was taken at the time of when UBBS took over from Pius XII College. That's a portrait by Father Rouche. The next portrait is of the most recent Chancellor, His Majesty King Letsie III. He was also, at one time, a student at the university. This is Sir Seretse Khama of Botswana, who was the second Chancellor of the university. It's a portrait also by Father Rouche. The third Chancellor was His Majesty King Moshoeshoe II, and I think he was the one who served in office as Chancellor and survived the most graduation ceremonies of any of our Chancellors. Here is our fourth Chancellor, King Sobhuza II of Swaziland. Of course, we rotated the chancellorship between the countries of Botswana, Lesotho and Swaziland until 1975, when this institution became the National University of Lesotho. Well, we've reached some of my old haunts, departments of mathematics and computer science. This is joined on to the second science block, the one which is completed. There's a third science block being under construction at the present time. This is part of the old science block extension, and many times I travel through that corridor and up to my office on the first floor. It's very interesting. I once taught the course in the history of mathematics, and the poster which I put up on the staircase showing the development of mathematics through the ages, it's still there. Here it is. Well, we thought maybe we should say a little bit about our publications over the years. They've changed in nature to some extent. In the early years, we did more in the way of academic publications, both of us, in journals overseas. And then, as we got to know Lesotho better, we thought, well, we should put on record things about Lesotho as well. One of the earliest of them was the Oxfam guides. I prepared a whole series with Sumitra's help. In fact, she typed some of them guides to the different districts of Lesotho. Mohotlong, here we've got Maseru, Mafeteng, Laribi, Butabuti. In fact, we covered all the districts. And it was probably partly the result of apartheid, because Sumitra and I couldn't take holidays together in South Africa, so we systematically took our holidays in each of the districts of Lesotho, and finally we documented a little bit about the history and the interesting things in each of the districts. And it was because of that that I was later approached by Winchester Press to produce a guidebook to Lesotho. And that guidebook, this is the first edition, went through 3 editions. This was the second edition. And finally it was combined in a 3rd edition with Botswana and Swaziland, making a very big book. It wasn't an appropriate way of doing a guidebook. It would have been better in 3 parts. And in fact, we disbound the Lesotho part of the time. Actually, our son appears on the front cover in the tiny corner here with his friend Dennis Semugerere amongst the cosmos. Later, I wrote on all sorts of things. I collaborated with somebody called Ken Lewis on this book here. This was an educational project. And we worked on something called a pin board. It's a simple device for teaching geometry. If you look on this board, you've got some very obvious squares. For example, that is 4 square units. But it's not so obvious what is the size of that one, or this one, or indeed this one. Actually, this is 5 square units if you work it out. It takes a bit of doing. This big one is 10 square units. And you can use this device to actually develop by a series of steps a proof of Pythagoras' theorem. We got asked from time to time to write articles for magazines. Now, I think, are these yours? Yes, this is one of yours. This one, do you want to hold it up? This one's about the spiral aloe. Indeed.
Unique to Lesotho.
Yes, endemic, in fact.
Endemic, yes.
And say something about spiral aloe. You went out counting with students?
Yes, we went out to Ncheng, a very good site in those days, and we kept an aloe population register. But to my great regret, other people had discovered this very good site and left very few thriving plants in the site that was very well developed at one time. That
the Highlands Water Project might re-establish that site, and that's contained in this consultancy report, which I did with a bit of help from Sumitra as well. The zoning project for Phase 1B of the Highlands Water Project. That's another one of yours. You did a whole series. This is the In-Flight magazine, isn't it?
Yes,
of
the
Lesotho
Airways. Yes.
And you did quite a series of ones on different species of flowers.
Mainly mountain flowers, I think. Yes.
The Satala magazine was a very good magazine when it came out, but it unfortunately is no longer with us. They kept persuading me to write about things. This one is about Lesotho postage stamps, a controversial subject because they haven't always reflected what we think they should have done about Lesotho, because all sorts of things from outside have intruded. Mickey Mouse, for example, appeared on the stamps for a while, but we managed to solve that in the end. This one, it's just about the brain drain, but I didn't write about the brain drain. I wrote about, inflation, yes, inflation. This is a popular account of inflation. And it's based on till slips from the supermarket. If you take the total on the till slip and you divide it by the length of the till slip in centimetres or whatever, you get a measure of inflation in maluti per centimetre. And by comparing it over the years, you can actually get a measure of inflation. Then, what about this one? I got asked to do the 50th anniversary booklet by the United Nations. And we stuck on the cover every imaginable kind of stamp that Lesotho has issued to do with one of the specialized agencies of the United Nations. And I had to deal with all the different, this is UNESCO, I had to deal with all the different United Nations agencies in Lesotho, UNICEF, and prepare text which was acceptable to them, FAO. And then this is about the UNDP itself, I think, the United Nations Development Programme, should be. There's probably several pages about that, yes. That's the Katsi Dam, it wasn't constructed then. Their contribution to geological maps, that's the offices of the UNDP in those days. And what have we got back here? So UNDP. Yes, that was in the days of Boutros Boutros-Ghali. And this was, we've just had the 60th anniversary, but that was the 50th anniversary booklet of the United Nations and its work in Lesotho. I contributed things for the Molepi on how well do you know Lesotho. It was a quiz. They were questions, you see, and they were trick questions, quite a few of them. And at the end of it, you could score how well you knew Lesotho. And, well, 3 correct answers or less, it seems that you must be new to Lesotho. And people would stop me in the street in Maseru and say, hey, did you know I'm new to Lesotho? I did your test. And I only got 2 questions right. So I'd made them rather difficult. But I tried to make them very interesting. Between us, we've written all sorts of things in all sorts of places. Sometimes we do it together, sometimes we do it separately. Let me see, this one. Yes, that's one of yours. This was one of the tourist magazine, Lesotho Kingdom in the Sky. People were always asking us to write things. Yes, I did something for that one. That one is tracking the world's biggest game. The world's biggest game is dinosaurs. And they leave their footprints all over the place, as we've seen in Roma Valley. And also, in some places, there are footprints in relief on the roofs of a rock shelter. That one's in Hatadimo in Butabuti district.
Yes.
The Garden Kingdom in the Sky. But I remember that the editor of the magazine changed 1 or 2 things, and I was a bit cross with her for doing that. That's a spring view in the Roma Valley, which is the main picture for this particular story. That one was done for a university in Bordeaux in France. It's the French and the Kingdom of Lesotho, a bibliographical study. That was one of mine. We co-edited this, actually. We wrote about half of it. We got a manuscript which was fairly incomplete, multiply authored, and we rewrote it, added to it. Some of it was quite adequate, but a lot of it was missing bits and pieces, and we added a lot of our own photographs to this, and we did a lot of graphics, and we produced pages like this, showing the different ecological zones, really, aren't they?
Yes.
I mean, well, they're not quite ecological, they're
vegetation
zones of Lesotho. So that one was the Afro-Alpine grassland. And on the front cover we've got a number of different pictures of Lesotho's biodiversity, including fungi, butterflies. That's a diso, isn't it? That's an orchid, yes, a lizard, and so on. That one, Catalogue of the Massotisi Archives. There's the old man D.F. Ellenberger on the front cover with his library of books behind. And he actually sold that library because he needed money, he had many children, to the Mission Society finally. And it became the nucleus of the Marija archives. It was the beginning of it. Some of the books in the Marija archives, you could even recognize some of them on the shelf behind. Now, this was his catalogue. We found the catalogue, it was a manuscript catalogue, just looking like this. in French and Sesotho actually, and this is a transcription of it. This work was done with Beatrice Lasserre. Beatrice Lasserre was a Swiss volunteer librarian who was working in Lesotho, and she had done quite a bit of work on this catalogue, and I encouraged her that we should publish it. But I actually did the typing of it using, in those days, an old Amstrad word processor, which was the latest technology. And it was sponsored 1987 by ISAS, which I was working for, Institute of Southern African Studies. Actually, the sponsorship was from Paris, actually. We got some money from the French, but Marie Archives was the other publisher. This one, Lesotho's Heritage in Jeopardy. I was the chairman of the Protection and Preservation Commission. That's the short name for it. It's got a much longer name. And it covers a lot of stories. Terrible thing about the spiral aloes being being sold. They're a protected plant, but there they are on the heads of women who came round to sell them. And the result is that most of the aloes in Western Lesotho are now, all the sites are extinct, I think. Other pictures have got examples of rock painting. That was the AROL project, analysis of rock art in Lesotho. The Protection and Preservation Commission worked fairly closely with that. And there's other material on archaeology, paleontology, and so on. And historic buildings. I've contributed all sorts of things. I've contributed to the list for Educational Research Journal, to the South African Philatelist, and it seems also the Lesotho Law Journal. And then a big one was the history of Maseru. That was a Swedish project. The Swedes were helping Lesotho with its town planning. And they came to me and they said, well, before we start, we'd like to know how Maseru got to the way it is. Do you know anything about the history of it? And I said, well, I know a little. So I told them what I knew. And they said, well, if we wanted to do it properly, what would it cost? So I said, well, we can make a project. We can involve a lot of students doing the field work. And it means I've got to read through 100 years of newspapers to find out what's happened. I went to Bloemfontein to look through the Friend newspaper. I luckily had a file of the Lesotholand News available. That started in 1927. And we did this book on Maseru. An artist helped to draw the cover, which shows the first train coming across the bridge in Maseru in December 1905. When the bridge was opened. In those days there were no motor vehicles, it was only a train which came across, but later that same bridge was shared for many, many years by motor vehicles. And this book is full of pictures of old Maseru of various kinds, old and newer Maseru, and it includes a whole series of pictures, aerial photographs, showing how Maseru has changed. If we look at these two here, we've got, this is the area known as the Khaloaning, or the old name is Hamamakanakisi. Here's the road, old dirt road coming from Maseru. This picture is 1961, and this picture is 1989. And you can see that the whole area, which was fields, has now become a sprawling peri-urban suburb of Maseru. That's when we worked on together. That was we were asked to edit this. This is the national strategy on Lesotho's biological diversity. So I couldn't do any of this without Sunitra, because she knows all the botanical side of things.
Well, some.
And so we really need to work together on these. And then we've actually worked together on quite a few quite a few of our guides. Now, we do our own publications as well. And as you can see down the bottom here, we've got our own logo, House 9 Publications, and which is the house. And we produce these. They're informal publications in a way, because they're literally done in-house. They're photocopied by Mamsongo, and she does the binding. And then But we do make them semi-formal because they all get an ISBN, International Standard Book Number, and so they're in international databases. And this particular one was a guide to the campus flowers. Now, it was meant to make it easy. It's done by colours. So if you know the colour of the flower, the other information that's given is the actual scientific name, the English name. So this one is Aloe maculata, variety Vicksburgensis, spotted aloe, Lachala in Sesotho, and then the 0.5 indicates the average height, or the range of heights in some cases. And then we've put in here little flower symbols which show the months in which we've found it flowering on the campus. We in the same series we did the fungi, and this is fungi of Lesotho. It's based on all records of fungi from other parts of Lesotho that other people have made, but the vast majority of the fungi which are in this we found actually on the campus. And I would come home and bring a whole lot of fungi, lay them out on the table, and it was Sumitra's job to identify them. And she did that very well. We identified the edible ones, and we ate the edible ones. And I think we've been eating about 10 or 12 different species of edible fungi from the campus, and we're still alive, so she's done a good job at identifying them, because otherwise we might not be alive. Oh yes, these are some of the really nice ones. Are the ink caps. These ones grow. They used to grow on the lawn outside what we call the new science block, but now we've got a new science block, the one that's still being built, and those lawns have disappeared. And this is the one that's sometimes called Lawyer's Wig, isn't it? Mm. Now we've done the trees on the campus as well. You can see with this one, it's all it's ready for a second edition because there's a massive additional information inside, and when we're ready for a second information, we write in all the second edition. We write in all the changes which have got to be made, and we've been helped by a number of people, and I think Greg Coppe has sent us. He's sent us a whole. Yes, he's got a lot of maps here of the campus. Somewhere in here. Yes, they're in this folder here.
But everything is changing now with the building activities.
It was a base map by himself, but he filled in all the trees on all the different species. But if we do the second edition, it's going to be an obituary notice for a lot of those trees, because they've been cut down in the last year or two. An enormous number of campus trees have actually been cut down to make way for the new buildings. Well, it's progress of a kind. This one, what was this? Oh yes, Masodi. Yes, I did a series in here, and the series was, I collaborated with a former student and then colleague of mine, Palesa Sekudi, and we wrote about, this is part 4, yes.
In-house journal.
Yes, this is the in-house journal of the LHDA, the Lesotho Highlands Development Authority, and this was in 5 different parts, and must be in here somewhere. Yes, there it is. It's there, but without the page number. There it is. So Jobo Motiani, and here he is with his family. Yes, you hold that. Was a very remarkable Lesotho. He was one of the early intellectuals, and he eventually became a minister in the Lesotho Evangelical Church, then called the Paris Evangelical Missionary Society. And he was the founder of the Sahong Hong Mission eventually. But in 1887, I think it is, they made this journey. He accompanied the resident commissioner on a journey through the Maluti. And the resident commissioner, Sir Marshall Clark, wrote his own account of the journey. But ahead of that, Jobo Motiani wrote his own account in the Sidinyana newspaper. And we took that original account and translated it and compared it also with the Marshall Clark's version. They're very different in many ways because each saw the Maluti and the people who just begun to live there in the 1880s in a completely different light. And they went right to the very source of the Senku River. Lita la Senku, it's a kind of marshy area at the source. And so we wrote about that because that water is the water that's feeding into the Highlands Water Project, and so it was relevant to do it in their magazine. Another methodology there. Then this one. Missionary excursion. This is the manuscript which Albert Bruch discovered in Paris, in French.
In the archives.
In the archives of the Missionary Society. And I think, though, it was Mr. Kruger, the old archivist. I think he kept it because he was in some ways a descendant of probably one of the daughters of Abuse. Abuse was one of the pioneer missionaries, and in 1840, together with King Moshoeshoe, they planned a joint expedition to go to the sources of the Orange River, really. And but they were going to do it through the lowlands. So they did this journey from Tababasiu through the foothills of Lesotho, and talking about the people, the places, as they went along in great detail. Abuse was writing a diary, keeping a record of everywhere they went. From Tababasiu they went first of all to the Muddy Moon Cave where they slept. I think 2 nights later they were in the Pitseng Cave, although it was not called Pitseng at that time. And about 3 nights later they were in the cave which is known today as Dipofum. And it's a very big and beautiful cave. And then they went on more or less to where Oxbow is today. And in translating this, we also walked the journey. But as I read it, I realized that the Dipofum cave was one that we'd actually slept in right back in 1970. You remember that?
Yeah, yes.
And we didn't have a very good night's rest.
No, there were goats there with bells around their necks, and every time they'd shake their head, the bells would go. So it wasn't very restful, was it?
But because we slept in the cave, I realized that actually it was the same cave that was the one that Moshoeshoe had slept in together with the missionary Abuse and their party in February 1840. And actually a sequel to that is that Dipofum cave, I think on a recommendation of myself to the LHDA, has been developed as a visitor centre there, and it's developed as a tourist facility. And so you can actually go there. It's called Dipofum. Dipofum means the place of elands, because of the paintings of elands which are on the wall. But it's got a lot of historical associations with King Moshoeshoe. So this book actually starts at Tababasiu. There's Tababasiu where it was, how it looked in those days. Everybody thinks that a long time ago people were living in rondavels, but they weren't. Rondavels were only introduced in Lesotho in the 1850s. This picture is about 1840. People were still living in kind of Mehlongwafadzi, hemispherical huts with very low entrances. There were no doors and windows in those days, and before you went to bed you took in a bit of mokwampiri, wasn't it? Mokwampiri is the tree which scratches, means literally the one which scratches the hyena, and that was to deter hyenas coming into your house at night. Things were very different in those days. And in this book we've included a lot of maps showing the journey. I walked almost all the route, trying to see the landmarks which were pointed out by Thomas Abuse. But in doing this, I was collaborating with Albert Bruch. Albert Bruch was amazing. Every single name that came up in the book, practically, he knew the descendants. If they became Christians, he could find their baptismal record or their marriage record in the mission records. And he provided an enormous amount of additional information. The translation was mainly done by me because we were translating into English, which was my language. But whenever I got stuck, I went to him with these obscure French words to find out what they should be. So that was an interesting one. And that's been published. We got some help from because it was a French manuscript, we did get help from what was called CREDU, the Centre de Recherche, d'Échange et de Documentation Universitaire, which was a French agency helping African universities which were doing things which had something in relation to French culture. 1991 that one was, and it's unfortunately out of print. We're going to have to do another edition. We printed 1,000 and they've all gone. And then House 9 Publications has taken on also actually doing reprints. Here's an example. This is a book which was originally published in the 1920s, and it was about the first Anglican bishop in Lesotho, Francis Balfour. And when I was doing my bibliographical work, well, I still am, I couldn't find a copy of this book in Lesotho. I eventually found it in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. There didn't seem to be a single copy in the country. But Stephen Gill of the Marija Archives, he very fortunately found a copy overseas, a second-hand, very battered copy, and I borrowed that copy from him, and from that we've made the facsimile. And that's done on the photocopy of Amamplongo. We've incorporated the original photographs. We've added a new introduction, which includes a map showing the places associated with Balfour. Balfour was a great horseman. He rode right through the Maluti. It's very interesting. He went to places like Kabani, Seslawatebi and so on, which are still quite remote today. I think it was in Kabani that he wrote about eating namiakama, hartebeest meat. Mm-hmm. Well, the hartebeest went extinct in Lesotho somewhere around 1914, I think. So he was recording one of the last meals that could be made from that particular antelope. And we added an index. And it's a very small edition, but at least it means that libraries in Lesotho and elsewhere can now have this book, which is really quite rare. Well, something else that comes out of House 9 is summary of events in Lesotho. This one happened really by accident. In 1994, we had a very unfortunate incident when the army broke into two factions, and they were fighting each other in Maseru. They were also not giving any statements as to why they were doing it. And people were asking me, as if I might know, what's going on in Lesotho? And the truth was, we didn't really know what was going on. I mean, we could observe certain things, but we didn't know why it was happening. But actually, I did get some quite good information. There were some British Army who were associated with the training of the Lesotho Army, and they knew a little bit more. And I got insights from them and from other people. And so I wrote at that time, I made it was really not widely circulated, a summary of what, from my point of view, I thought was going on in Lesotho. And that began, because there were sequels to it, a periodical. The very first issues were looking like this, and they were only, there you are, first quarter 1994. They were only a few pages long. But as it grew and it expanded to cover virtually everything going on in Lesotho. Partly a summary of what appears in the press, and partly stories, there you are, it's the royal wedding there, partly stories which we had our own. We wrote a lot of our own stories, about things that happened which the press missed, like the fall of the meteorite and that sort of thing. And also we did quite extensive obituaries of important people that died and so on. And we're still doing it. It's now approximately 24, 26 pages a quarter. We usually include things like the rainfall. There's a rainfall chart. Also inflation. We find newspapers don't write much about inflation. The information is available from the Bureau of Statistics. It's analysed by the central bank, but it doesn't come into any popular or semi-popular things that people read. Our customers for this particular periodical are libraries in Lesotho and overseas, and a lot of individuals connected with Lesotho, both in Lesotho and overseas. It's expanded rather embarrassingly so that we get more and more requests for it. So we're trying to cut down, and we've now made an arrangement with the Transformation Resource Centre in Maseru, and they've put it onto their website. So anybody who wants to look at it can find it on www.trc.org.ls. As we've been here a long time, and as time went on, people kept saying to us, what's going to happen when you're not here? How will we get information? Well, we're not the only sources of information, but it's true that we've been here longer than anybody else, and as a result we do know quite a few things about all sorts of things, really. I mean, it's a very, very miscellaneous set of things. If I'm anything, I'm a professor of miscellaneous studies rather than the one particular subject these days. And Sumitra also has got a very wide knowledge of it. She contributes particularly on the biological side. So we started something which we called Know Your Campus. And it was a weekly insert into the campus newsletter, information flash. And every week we wrote about something different. And we should also alert people, because I feel that what we teach in our classes in the university is only a very small percentage of information about the world as a whole, but even about Lesotho and about the local surroundings and the valley. We find people leave here and they don't know the names of the trees, the birds, they don't know the history of the institution, and so on. So it's an attempt to try to correct that. And we did it as an insert, a weekly page in the university's weekly newspaper, Information Flash. This is one of the recent ones, April 2006, and it appears usually on the back page. This is number 191, so you can see how many we've done. And this particular one was on, well,
rainfall, was it?
Near record summer rains, yes. So we put in charts showing the rainfall for that was March, and then the general summary for the different months of the summer, and compare it with other years. So, well, what have we written on? We've written on all sorts of things. Here's a few examples. The Lesothosaurus. We've got some fossil footprints on the campus. They may be Lesothosaurus. Anyway, it was an opportunity to write about the Lesotho's own dinosaur, which is, by the way, very well known to American school children, because in all those dinosaur books in North America, Lesotho, which is Lesothosaurus, it's a small dinosaur the size of a dog, and it appears in many children's books. We wrote about campus snakes. I think we did a second edition of that because we got some new ones. We got a puff adder in our garden, and we've had rinkhouse as well. That's the rinkhouse. So we've added 2 or 3 species to the total number of snakes on the campus. We did it on the science block paintings, which have an interesting story. Some of those were originally copied by Joseph Alpen when he was travelling with the San or Mora king right back in 1873. But this is a copy of the copy. Abraham's book is a flower which grows with very, very flat leaves on the ground. What's it in Sesotho? Lemanama, is it?
Yes.
Lematlana. It's on here. We did all sorts of odd things. We measured the tallest trees on the campus. We had an argument, which is the tallest tree on the campus? And we measured a lot of trees, and that's a story in itself, how you can do that, because you don't measure them by climbing them. And then we found which was the tallest. And the tallest one then was 31.4 meters. It was a Eucalyptus camaldulensis, one of the gum trees, the red gum. Father Bacher, extraordinary man who ran a rival university across the road, or at least a centre to harmonise cosmology and theology. And we're grateful to him because he set aside the land which has now become the Roma Business Centre. He was buried there, by the way, and he had to be disinterred, and he's reburied up on the hill next to the Lesotho Observatory Foundation. Lacewings. You get some very interesting insects floating around, and most people don't know what they are. One of the most beautiful ones is the lacewing. And actually, to make that particular version, that particular KYC, what we did was we photocopied the lacewing. We actually put it on a photocopier to get that beautiful sort of filigree pattern on the wings. We had an earth tremor. I managed to find out where the epicenter was. It was a little way from here, but since many people had experienced it, it was in the Machaleng Valley. Then people were interested to know about that. The water supply. The water supply has been a subject of many KYCs. Sometimes it gets me into trouble. But when the water supply fails, you tend to criticize those who are managing it and make suggestions. The indigenous plant garden, that was established in connection with the new science block. There's a map of it with the plants. The view from the campus, we wrote quite a lot about the different mountains which are visible, the villages which are visible, the history of those villages, and things of that kind. The campus dairy herd. I think I told, that Sam Motlamelo, my director, is a great, a very skillful manager of a dairy herd, and the dairy herd came from him, but we traced the descendants, and there was a bit of incest amongst the cows, which we recorded in this one. Mammals. Remarkable thing happened. We found a dead bat at the bottom of our oak tree, and it was a Egyptian free-tailed bat. There's the free tail. Often the tail is incorporated into the actual wings or the body structure, and it was only the second record of that bat for Lesotho. I'm sure it's much commoner, but people just haven't recorded it. Here's a striped mouse, and on the campus we actually have the Cape clawless otter, kiwi in Lesotho. Come on, you talk about that one. That was yours. A lot of these have got your name at the bottom.
Yes, this is quite an old building by our standards. It was put up in the science block, and the initial movers of that was Amy Giacomo.
That's the herbarium, which is like a library of plants.
Plant libraries, yes. Plant collection.
There was a very hard-working, I think we should say, Amy wasn't she? We knew her well, and her husband. And they were together, a botanist and a zoologist, or entomologist actually, studying insects. And they made contributions in the time of past the 12th College. But the botanical garden and the herbarium, which was established by Amy, has actually continued to this day.
And more has been added, of course.
Of course, yes, much more later. Madiba.
I don't know if it's known widely. Yeah.
What about Madiba? Yeah.
Madiba.
Well, I mean, we were the first university to give him an honorary degree. He's got about 100 now, including Oxford, Cambridge, and every university of any stature in the world, and a lot of others. But NUL was the very first to give him an honorary degree. He couldn't receive it, of course, because he was incarcerated on Robben Island. But Alfred and Zoe actually took some risk to come because he had to overfly South Africa. He came to actually receive the degree.
He was then the secretary of the
ANC,
yes.
In exile. Parrot's feather. Now you've written a lot about parrot's feather.
Well, that's a weed which got out of control and has choked one of our dams, and we think that some family which kept fish
might have innocently poured the fish in. Maybe their children, they didn't want to see the fish destroyed, and they poured it all into the dam. But parrot's feather, what's it, Myriophyllum aquaticum, isn't it?
Yes, yes.
Is a very dangerous weed, and once it infests a dam, it can go downstream from that dam, and from downstream from our dam, Dipiring River, the Korokoro River, the Putietsana River, then the Mohokari River, then the Senku, and can get into dams in South Africa as well. So it's potentially a serious risk. We've been trying to do something about the eradication, but it's very difficult. Trees of the campus, that reflects the publication we also did.
Yes, one of the early
yes,
publications
yes.
about the campus.
Here are some of the leaves,
And
including oak, and that one is ginkgo, isn't it?
yes, there's only one of that by the science
Yeah,
block.
there's one ginkgo tree on the campus. The ES expeditions, I think we talked with Lesotho a little bit about that, and that's just a summary. And then snails. You remember that? There was somebody in South Africa that was studying snails, and we sent him sample snails, and he identified them for us because he was doing a snail atlas. And but then we looked up some. The commonest one is this one that's common in Europe as well, and it's the brown garden snail, Helix aspersa, and it's a nuisance in the garden. We've got hundreds, if not thousands, of them. We wondered if we could put them to any use, and I read up that they were edible. So we prepared them, we cooked them, and I think Miss Cecilia looked in horror. She saw me eating them in the kitchen. Didn't think I would be alive the next day, but I lived to tell the story. I didn't repeat the experiment. They are edible. They're not very unpleasant to eat, but they're not something that you would eat every day, I think. Luckily, we've got in the garden, the hardy-dart ibis is coming in the garden now,
Yes,
and they do eat them. So they're keeping them under control. An interesting event was the transit of Venus. So we wrote about that, and we were lucky. It was a clear day. It was in winter, wasn't it? And we actually managed to project it onto cars and get a good view through Shozi David Mapisa's, Mamplongo's husband's telescope. He has a telescope for looking at birds, and we borrowed it for the transit of Venus. We've done a bit about the campus on postage stamps. That, for example, is the Catholic chapel, which has appeared on the Lesotho postage stamp. It's one of many stamps which reflect the campus. And then the Friends of St. Joseph's Hospital, well, to keep people informed about that, we run quite a few KYCs on St. Joseph's Hospital. And then the old lady who makes the mats, but also makes the stools, Nkono Jamina. This is an obituary notice, I'm sorry to say. There she is with her little great-granddaughter, and that's a drawing of, well, somebody like her carrying mats for sale and brooms.
Yes.
And then the first cuckoo. O cuckoo, shall we call thee bird, or but a wandering voice? And it's very true that the cuckoo we have here is like the European cuckoo, completely different sound, but it's a wandering voice. You hear it, but if you want to see it, you've got to be very clever. It sits up in the gum trees around us, calling, even calls at night. It's at midnight you get it calling sometimes. And it's one of 3 species of cuckoo. So we wrote something about cuckoos. And indeed, we've written quite a few KYCs about birds. This is the birds seen in 2004. And it included then 2 new birds to the campus in 2004. We got the first record of the Cape Batis. A colleague called Ian Love was the one who reported that. And then I think myself and Flozi, David Mapisa, we saw the glossy ibis on the campus for the first time. We've written about the geology and the geomorphology. When you see things around you, you take them for granted in the landscape, but actually there's a story behind them. And this is a continuation in a way. This is about the red beds, which are the Elliott Formation, which outcrop on the campus if you dig a hole deep enough, and about the fossils which can be found in them. Funnily enough, the campus is sitting more or less on the boundary between the Jurassic and the Triassic. It's just a coincidence. We do a Christmas crossword puzzle, and there's a few of our colleagues who become addicted to that and say, can we do another one? But I say, no, only once a year. And then last year we had the 50th anniversary of the science faculty. That's one of the KYCs we did for that. We got a lot of help from Lorraine McCann, who was she was actually the founder in many ways of the science faculty, about the early history of the science faculty. It was founded the first 10 years of past the 12th College, 45 to 55, they only taught humanities subjects, and science was introduced in 1955, and that's one of the early scenes in the lab. I think our dentist is there, Ishmael Telejani, yes, there he is, this one there. And Lydia Makubu, who became the Vice-Chancellor in Swaziland, she's in that picture as well. And Jane Manier, who became a doctor.
The early women doctors.
Yeah, but she did most of her work she lived in America most of the time. More birds. And then this was a sad one we had to do recently, which was the obituary for Ernest Rouche. Father Rouche was many years at the university, and he did many things. He designed the stained glass in the Catholic chapel. He actually designed the university coat of arms as well. The NUL coat of arms was done by him. And he also painted the portraits of the early chancellors, which are in the university Senate room. And he did the mosaic in the university entrance. And he did many, many other things as well. He was a good architect too. He designed many mission buildings. And he did the painting, which is in Father Gerard's chapel, adjoining the cathedral. Now, at the end of each year, we've actually put these together and indexed them. So this is the first one, and then the next year, 41 to 84. It's not quite as many weeks as there are in the year, but numbers as there are weeks in the year. And then this is the third volume, and this is the most recent one. And we need to prepare a new one, actually. We've done enough to do the next one as well. But one of the very pleasant associations that we've had has been with the Marija Printing Works. It's very old printing works. It goes back to the 1860s. But in recent years it's got modern buildings and modern machinery, and they can do very good colour reproductions. And we worked with them on producing calendars. Calendars use pictures from other people, but quite a lot of the pictures have been actually mine. And they are quite popular, I think, with people. I mean, this is the kind of calendar we have. It's always got 7 pages, it's got a cover, and then it's got 6 incidental pictures inside. This one, for example, I just see here. Is a
dam.
Well, that one, yes. There's a whole variety of pictures here. That's one of the hostels on the campus. There's Maketa again. It's always coming out, covered with snow. Sorry, we can't show it covered with snow on our other pictures this time. So these calendars. That was a lady making a mat. This is a picture I particularly like. It's taken at Moseniking in the Senku Valley, a very remote place. But when I was taking it, right behind me there were some rock paintings on the wall. And it's a very, very beautiful part of Lesotho, but still very inaccessible. You can't get there by road. It's a view of Machachi on the front of the 2003 calendar, and of Tabatelle on the front of the 2004 calendar. And this one, I think that year we did quite a lot of rural scenes, and that one includes, I think, we made a lot of these, by the way, into postcards, as you can see here. And of the postcards that we sold, this picture was the bestseller. Also a postcard. And it shows a lady coming back from St. Joseph's Hospital. She's taken the baby down to the hospital to be looked at. And she's a Mutwedzi in Sesotho. That means a woman who's recently had a child. And the nice thing about this picture is that the horse is also, in a way, a Mutwedzi because it's got a foal. I think I like this one quite a bit. This one shows rock paintings. And they're at Dili Dili, or Tili Tili, in Kuching district, quite a remote place. You have to walk to it. And there's very, very nice sort of expression, rather sad expression, on the face of the eland. And look how the artist has painted the eland in a very awkward position. It's seen from the rear with its head turning round at the front. And there's also here a baby eland underneath its mother. We've included pictures of the university on postcards. That's an aerial picture taken a long time ago, actually, when the campus had far fewer buildings than it does today. That was 1970. I think I was flying from Kachasnek to Maseru when I persuaded the pilot to take that picture. That's one of the front of the university that's been used in various places, including the front of the university calendar. And that picture there is the fossil footprints at Marija. You have to go there about 12:30 to 1 to get the sun at just the right angle, so it shows them, puts them into relief. And that one, that's an old card, but that's been copied and used for various purposes. Actually, that was my gardener in Tati Lazaro, and that's taken up on the plateau above Clodley Cave. So there's really been a lot of different, so too many to be actually all shown, but a few examples of things that we've depicted. Katsi Dam, highest dam in Africa, and unusual picture because it's actually spilling at that point. Travelling by motorboat or speedboat on the Katsi Dam. Some boys on a horse above the dam. I think you can see the water in the bottom. That's a picture of a bus. I think I took that when travelling from Samongkong by bus. And in the old days, you used to have to travel on a very rugged bus. And then at Ramabanta, you changed to a more modern type of bus because the road was better. Well, this picture was taken on the way to Samongkong. And I remember now, my son and myself had mountain bikes. And one day we set out, after a bit of practice, to ride all the way from Roma to Samongkong. And when you're on a bike, you have more opportunities to take pictures. So that was sheep on the road. And then actually that's the Samongkong bus which we encountered on the road. We did actually afterwards write that up in the Sitala magazine. And that's our son, John, now called Jonty, at Samongkong. And we incorporated a number of other pictures and text. Let's see what else we've got here. A nice view from the campus of the Ranger Mountains, including Maheta. It dominates the scene from here. The Marija Church, the oldest church in Lesotho, built by Francois Meda in the 1840s. The roof is held up with poles which were originally ship's masts. And actually the church is made of bricks which are baked in kilns using sheep's dung. And in those days, Lesotho was quite prosperous. And you couldn't find a lot of people to make bricks. And the people who made bricks were the Bapedi. They were Bapedi coming down to the Cape looking for jobs. And some of them stopped over in Marija and were employed for some years. And indeed, some of them settled. There's a place called Bopedi, Hamurutwani, near Marija, where a lot of them still live. Even the chief is a Mopedi. Marija Festival, a very popular annual event, which has all sorts of things going on. But stalls of all kinds, but there's a lot of dancing, choral competitions, games competitions, and so on. Well, this is an old picture of Taba Basu on Mashweshwar's day. This is a picture of Bale, that's to say women undergoing initiation. And they wear these masks called Masira, and here they are, I think, gathering wood. That was taken in Butabuti district, somewhere near Sakubu. This is an interesting rock formation. It's not very far from here. You can actually walk to it from here, although it's a long walk. It's between here and Taba Basu. And, well, various people are on this picture. Our son is up here. His friend Dennis is there. That's a lecturer, Rolf van der Geer. And it's an extraordinary rock formation, almost impossible. And I went back 2 years later with some people to show them the same place because they wanted to see it. And the people in the village told me it had fallen down. And sure enough it had. I thought these things only happened in geological time, but they happen in real time as well. So part of that has now collapsed. What have we got here? Spiral aloes, that's your department.
Oh, that was taken at Encheng.
Encheng, yes. That was when we were counting spiral aloes.
It was a big area full of spiral aloes. But if you go now, there's nothing left.
They're extinct at that site, I'm afraid. Dancing, that was on the Mashweshwar's Day occasion at Kholodikani, near Setleketsing. And these people were doing a dance called Ntlamo. Very vigorous dance. That's another kind of dance. These are recent initiates, I think. And there's somebody there playing lesiba, which is a traditional instrument, half wind and half string. And others are dancing around quite exuberantly, and there's an audience, which is a dog.
And a camera. That's
the rather extraordinary relatively modern rock shelter, which we've got several families living in it at Hakome in Berea district. What have we got here? Oh yes, that's also near Setleketsing. That's a school choir competition. There's the teacher in his best suit conducting the school choir. Finally, yes, that's an interesting one. This is Memamulla. We used her and her baby on a calendar picture in 2004. But I remember that this was quite an old picture. And as a result, I wondered, where are these people now? I made some inquiries, and they were still around. Here's a picture, and indeed, there she is, holding the calendar, and the baby, 18 years later, was a student at the university. St. Joseph's Hospital in Roma was founded in 1938. The building behind me is the newer building, which was opened in 1966. It was built with help from the German Catholic organization Miserior. This hospital was associated for many years with Dr. Martha Sigmund, Memaretta, as she is known to the Basotho. She came here in 1949, and she was very instrumental in raising the funds for the building with the help of overseas friends. She left the hospital in 1970. We've been very much associated with this hospital, not least of all because our son was born here in 1972, and we've known many of the doctors who worked in this hospital as well as the other staff. However, the hospital went into a period of crisis. In 1989 we learned it had no doctors at all. We came, Sumitra and I, to the hospital to meet the administrator to find out why that would be so. And they said please help us find a doctor. That was a Friday. Well, I don't know how we did it, but amazingly, we managed to find a doctor, Dr. Jacques, who came out of retirement, and Ngaka Jaka, as he was known to the Basotho. He lived in Lesotho since 1938, and he was working in the hospital on the following Monday. But the hospital was in trouble. It had financial problems, it had staff problems, and at that point, with the help of the wife of a colleague, Mrs. Mpo Buku, we formed the Friends of St. Joseph's Hospital. I've been successively the secretary, the treasurer, the overseas fundraiser for the Friends of St. Joseph's Hospital, or the St. Joseph's Hospital Appeal Fund, as we were officially known. Well, I've handed that over to some of my colleagues, and in particular, Mamplongo, who's here with me, she has taken a lot of responsibility for the work of the Friends. She comes and visits the hospital most weeks, meets the patients, finds out their needs. We have a fund to help them, buy them small essentials. And she knows the hospital inside out now much better than I do. And she is the representative of the Friends on the governing board of the hospital. Mamplongo, can you say something about what you do?
I am Mamplongo Mapisa. I have once been the patient in this hospital, and at that time I learned that there are so many patients who come from afar, and sometimes they run out of stock to use things like toilet paper. Some come without towels, and I decided that I should come every week to the hospital and make sure I buy them some things that they didn't bring from home. And for some who can't have money to buy things like fruits and some towels, toilet paper and Vaseline, I always make sure that I buy them inside the hospital and give it to them and go. And with me, I always carry a flowery bag that I bring for them, newspapers and magazines that help them to read while they're still in bed. And I'm now at the management board of governors of the hospital.
We are now in the X-ray unit of St. Joseph's Hospital. This was one of the very big projects of the Friends of the hospital. The X-ray had broken down. The X-ray was very old, and there was absolutely no way of repairing it. And it was a challenge to the Friends to raise the money so that we could get a new unit. It took us a year to do it, and we were very much supported by Dr. Martha Sigmund, the doctor who worked at this hospital from 1949 to 1970. She raised a lot of money overseas, but we raised it from a lot of other sources, including the Irish government and a lot of individual people who contributed towards it. The X-ray unit was finally installed in 1996. And the hospital is now very, very fortunate, because they're very difficult to get, to have a trained graduate radiographer. He's standing beside me now. He comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and his name is Joel Nkambua, if I have it right. So I'm pleased to talk to you, Joel.
Yes.
Tell us, how many patients do you get X-rays a day?
We are receiving around 27 patients every day. They are coming from all over the country. This department is helping the hospital to manage to do the X-ray in general radiology.
Now, do you get accident victims sometimes?
Yes, sometimes we get victim of accident. They come here in emergency, we do the exam. Sometimes they come from others hospital, and they come here for the X-ray, and we do the X-ray, and they go back with the result.
And you actually get a number of patients who come from Maseru because the government facilities are overcrowded, is that right?
Yes. There is number of patients are coming from Maseru for only X-ray here.
Yes.
When the X-ray machine are broken in Quintu, they will come here for X-ray, and we are doing the exam here. We can send them back with the result to the doctor.
And then you get quite large numbers, I suppose.
Yes.
I think I could perhaps take this opportunity of thanking the friends of the hospital, some of whom will be seeing this film, our overseas friends particularly, who helped to contribute towards this unit. Thank you very much.
For everything the friend of St. Joseph Hospital has done for these people and for us. We are grateful and we thank you very much.
Well, I'm now standing in front of the Roma College of Nursing, which is very closely associated with St. Joseph's Hospital. Some of the funds which we raised in the Friends of the Hospital have also gone to help the College of Nursing, and it's a very great need because we're extremely short of nurses, and unfortunately a lot of our nurses go elsewhere. The Roma College of Nursing is situated in the old hospital, which closed in 1966 when it moved across the road to the present hospital. Well, the hospital appeal fund, which we were very much involved with, has undertaken all sorts of things to try to help the hospital. An important part has been the Needy Patients Fund. Medical care in Lesotho is not free, and the hospital actually charges even for very basic things. But we set up a fund where patients who really couldn't afford to come to the hospital could do so. They needed the recommendation of either their chief to say they couldn't afford to pay, or a clergyman, or one of the hospital doctors. If the hospital doctor could see this patient was clearly indigent, then in fact they qualify for that. And of course we did all sorts of other things. We paid for drugs and equipment. But the X-ray was the big one, but there are lots of other things. And also for training for the village health workers. And particularly recently, what has become sadly necessary is for people who are nursing people in villages who are terminally ill. We are in the middle of a scourge which is such as never really hit Lesotho at any time in the past. Probably about 1/3 of adults are suffering from infected with HIV/AIDS, and it's brought home to us even whilst we've been making this film, from news of 2 or 3 different deaths of people closely related to people that we know, and it's something which is eating at the whole heart of the fabric of society, as more and more elderly people, particularly women, grandmothers, are looking after grandchildren because the intermediate generation is no longer there. So this is a challenge for the hospital. Now, fortunately, the Swiss, we've been much working with the Swiss. In fact, remember when they came to Lesotho, we sort of kidnapped them and gave them lunch in order to try to get them to come back to help the hospital. And they actually are now funding an antiretroviral clinic at St. Joseph's Hospital, and there's going to be a paediatrician. His wife is also a paediatrician. I think they'll be coming in July of this year to work in the hospital for 2 years, and that will get the antiretroviral program really going, particularly for children, but it's available for adults, and very important for adults as well. Well, there's been a lot of voluntary work done, and indeed some of the old Swiss doctors who are in the hospital come back sometimes. Instead of taking their holidays, they come back to work in the hospital. Dr. Tetamanti, Surgeon Tetamanti, was here this year, and his wife, and they're among the big supporters of the hospital. In 1995, it was the 50th anniversary of the University at Roma. It started in 1945 as a very small Catholic college, Pius XII College. Pius XII, I think they called it originally, University College. Catholic University College, that's right. But it became known as Pius XII. The 50th anniversary coincided with the university hosting a meeting of the Vice-Chancellors of the Association of African Universities. And I think it was my suggestion, because I had been involved with the philatelic committee, that the university issue the Lesotho issue a set of postage stamps commemorating the occasion. And it fell to us to actually find the pictures and provide the designs. And what we finally came up with was one stamp commemorating Pius XII College. On that stamp we've got, it's taken when the campus was right open, but the main administration building was mainly there, and two of the Catholic fathers, Father Baniam and Father Hall, I've seen walking across the campus. I wasn't there in Pius XII days, and I managed to get the picture for that stamp from our friend, the late Joris Beemans. The second stamp was UBBS, University of Lesotholand, Bechuanaland Protectorate and Swaziland. That's the 50-cent stamp. And then we had a UBLS stamp. In fact, I think we had two UBLS stamps. This is a 70 centi stamp, which shows Mr. and Mrs. John Teka Teka outside Oppenheimer Hall. And I think it was taken on the occasion when the hall was opened by Harry Oppenheimer and the students are in their red gowns. And then there's a last picture of UBLS, University of Botswana, Lesotho and Swaziland. That's the front administration block when it was still one story. And then we go on to National University of Lesotho. Picture of the second picture, really, of the front of the university with the two-story block and the clock tower, which I think Colin Mackay, a Canadian member of the council, insisted should be on top. And finally, and that was one of your photos, you were at the occasion when we had the commemoration with all the vice-chancellors in procession, and there's the procession of vice-chancellors, and if I remember rightly, those ones in that rather interesting Arabic costume were from the University of Khartoum and perhaps some other Arabic-speaking country. And the lady was a newspaper which was founded in 1904 by Solomon Munne, who was the proprietor, but he was also helped by Abimael Tlali, whose name didn't appear on it for the first few years because he had a government job and he had to be careful. It was the first independent newspaper in Lesotho. It happened because Marija Printing Works installed new machinery in 1904 and they sold the old machinery. And Solomon Munne bought it and took it to Mafeking and set up his own printing works in Mafeking. Mafeking was very much the centre of intellectual life in Lesotho in those days. The newspaper was the first which wasn't subject to missionary censorship, so the writers could say what they felt about things. And as a result of that, I think Marija was perhaps regretting somewhat that it had sold the machinery because people could criticise the missionaries. And of course the government as well, within reason, within the laws of libel. This newspaper, unfortunately, unlike the missionary newspapers, almost completely disappeared. There were only, I think when I tried to track them down, 18 surviving issues, although it was a weekly newspaper from 1904 to 1937. And most of those that have been kept because they had stories. They were kept in the Marija archives because they had stories about missionaries, which they didn't actually like, but they kept them for reference. When was it? It's now nearly 2 years ago.
Yes, 2 years.
By chance, we were in Maseru, and the National Archives has suffered a number of unfortunate moves. And its last move had been from a house in Maseru West, where it had been stored, into the post office building. And to my surprise, because I didn't know that had been that move, the house was now empty. It was empty, it was unlocked, children were playing there, and, well, we assume the archival material had gone. But when we looked more closely, we discovered that the floors of the house collapsed under the weight of the documents, and when it had been cleared, presumably by convicts, I think, probably people who didn't know quite what they were doing. All the material which had fallen into the floor well had remained behind. And I checked this with the government archivist people, and they said, well, actually we've appraised this, there's nothing of value left, and so it should be destroyed. Well, when I looked at it, I thought, well, actually it's not quite as simple as that, because I could already see some interesting things there. And Mamplongo and I spent a day in that house, very dusty, uncomfortable conditions, because we were half under the floor. Very hot weather too. Looking through what had got behind. And amongst it, we found a whole roll of this newspaper, Naledi ya Lesotho, which had 105 issues in it. We'd only known 18 issues up to that point. And we brought them back. And we decided this must be preserved, copied, so that scholars can use it. It was extremely frail. This copy's already been repaired to some extent, and it's being prepared for photocopying. It's a difficult task, because what we do, what do? You reduce it.
Yes, I reduce it by 72%, and first photocopy the first half and make it A4, the lower part A4, and join the two A4s together with grid. Then at the end, I come up with A3 size, which afterwards I photocopy into A4, which is...
So ultimately, it comes down to this size. This is the display book in which we've been preparing the final copies. It comes down to A4 sheets. So let me see, what's this issue here? This is, because it's Naledi ya Lesotho, English version is The Star of Lesotholand, and it's in both languages. Founded in 1904. This is number 840, published in Mafeking, Lesotholand, 5th of April,
yes.
Missa, 1929. A weekly bilingual newspaper circulating throughout Lesotholand, Matatiele districts, Free State province, and etc. Also a medium for advertising government notices. And as usual, the front page of the newspaper is full of advertisements. That was customary in those days. Now, if we go over into the newspaper, we find a number of interesting stories. This one's about Josie Lafella, head of Lakota Lavafo. Sports news. The Lesotholand Cricket Club versus the Orange Free State. Interesting, isn't it? Because the Lesotholand Cricket Club was then apparently a mixture of P. Cellular, A. Hatlosa, W. Hawkins, and even the Orange Free State one was P. Van Wyk, A. Seroto, A. Schultz. There must be a history of cricket, which we don't know anything about anymore. But maybe this newspaper could reveal it. And then of course, there's news of the African National Congress, the ANC. ANC was founded right back in 1912, I think, and the newspaper must have covered that as well. Although we don't have all the issues, of course, we've still got a fragment of the total. The largest single project in which I have been involved in my time in Lesotho has been the Lesotho Annotated Bibliography. Started quite near the beginning, when I was interested in reading everything I could about Lesotho, and found there were many books, periodicals, and other items which were not available in Lesotho. So when I was overseas, I went to libraries, and I kept a card index of the items which I had seen with a summary of their contents. It so happened that Sheila Willett, who was then the deputy librarian, and later became the librarian of the Gaborone campus in Botswana, what was then UBLS. She got an approach from a publisher, Clio Press, to produce a Lesotho bibliography. She founded the Baleswa collection. That's a collection of Botswana, Lesotho, and Swaziland items in the library. And she had access to those, but she was very interested in my annotated items, things which were found overseas. So what happened was she approached me and we then collaborated. We worked with the press, and eventually emerged in the late 1970s. We went to press in 1977, but the book didn't get published till 1980. The volume on Lesotho in the World Bibliographic Series. This is my rather battered copy. When it came out, it was actually the thickest volume in the series, and that's because we persuaded the publishers. Lesotho is a small country. As an experiment, instead of doing a select bibliography, let's do a comprehensive one. They were innocent. They didn't know that really there was so much material written about Lesotho. So I think it was to their surprise that we got a book of over 500 pages. And the other volumes in the series for the other countries in the world, and eventually there were over 100 of them, were much smaller than this because they were select bibliographies. And I think there was only ever one volume in the series which was ever larger, and that was the volume on Japan. Our volume was larger than the one on the United States and on the Soviet Union and on many other countries. Well, when this was published in 1980, Sheila was already then librarian in Botswana, and there was actually no one here for the continuity of the project except myself. So I continued to do the work, assuming that in some way it might be published, and kept the results in a card index. It grew to many thousands of cards. By 1995, it seemed obviously that there was new technology available, and at that point, I started the project as a computer database. It was divided into approximately 198 sections, covering everything published on Lesotho. The progress of the computer database has been documented by what's now an annual brief survey of what has been done and what in the past year. This is the 6th edition, I think. Mainly it's a computer database. It now consists of, in fact, this was last July, but by now it's got something like 6,000 pages, around 9,500 to 10,000 items, and cross-references will be about 3,500. The actual parts of the bibliography where there's been a demand have also been prepared in hard copy. So they come out as House 9 publications. The original ones were published within my Institute of Education, but we went through a period of transition when there was the possibility of the Institute disappearing. So that's the point at which House 9 publications took over. This is section 79 in the bibliography. Here we go, Geology and Geomorphology, section 15. Census reports, this came out recently, topical because it was census this year, section 67. Mining, Kimberlite and Diamonds, section 16. Roads and Transportation, section 147. Rock Painting, section 132. Some are thicker than others. This one is 114 pages. This is a fairly thin one, Sephuti Language and Literature. Sephuti is the only language where the majority of the inhabitants live in Lesotho. The majority of the inhabitants speaking Sesotho live in South Africa. So it was worth doing a small volume for that. It's only 10 pages there. Essays and Literary Criticism, a more substantial one. Fiction in Sesotho, was one done under the auspices of the Institute of Education. Amphibians, section 165. Birds, this has been the biggest one so far. This is the 2nd edition, and it runs to 242 pages. Lozi, Silozi, is it's Sesotho really. It's Basotho in the 1820s, under Sebetwane, they conquered what's now Western Zambia, and they introduced their language. And although it's changed in character, been influenced by the neighbouring languages, it's still possible for Basotho to understand Silozi and for Malozi to understand Balozi, I think. Balozi to understand Basotho. Also known as Barodzi. Paleontology, with the Lesothosaurus on the front page. Soil erosion and soil conservation, with a picture on the front page which was actually made originally in 1894. And it shows that dongas are not a new phenomenon. Groundwater, particularly about boreholes. Hydrology and meteorology, particularly about river flow, very important for the Highlands Water Project, and also about meteorology, so rainfall and temperature. Allopolyphera and paleontology and palynology, study of fossil plants and fossil pollen. Well, of course, in these, although this has all been typed by me on the computer and produced by me, but I've had a lot of support from other people. My wife and Mum Plongo have done a lot of the proofreading, and Mum Plongo in particular is the one who has done the photocopying and the binding. And we have our own photocopier. I actually always have new sections in preparation. There's one here, Flora's Plant Diversity and Taxonomy. It's got to over 100 pages, but there's a lot more to go into it. And this is the one on theses. We've identified over 700 theses relating to Lesotho at the level of mainly masters and doctoral degrees, but also some of the more outstanding honours degree theses and even student dissertations if they contain material which is original. One thing that happened as a result of this work is that I did get recognition. The Association of Southern African Indexers and Bibliographers gave me an award for the most outstanding bibliography compiled in Southern Africa during 1999 to 2001. We've been through an era of enormous change. We have participated in the creation of an educated elite. But when we reflect about the poor of Lesotho, it is hard to think that they are really very significantly better off than they were 40 years ago. Lesotho suffers from having been the legacy of a nation which was created indirectly as a result of apartheid. It has more people than it has resources. Jobs are extremely scarce. Most people are unable to find paid employment, and where there is paid employment, most of it is in very poorly paid industrial work in garment factories in Maseru. Well, we're in an era of globalization. But what are the benefits of globalization? Certainly, one of them is that I can go with my ATM card to the bank, put it into the machine, and I can actually access bank accounts I might have in any country in the world. But that is of very little advantage to the ordinary Lesotho. The ordinary Lesotho doesn't even have a bank account. In fact, the advantage is only really to the educated elite. Now, globalization has a downside. The downside is it allows for mobility of people. We've lost a lot of our educated personnel. A lot of the people that we trained here, who are Lesotho citizens, they have left. They're working in South Africa or they're working overseas. It's particularly acute in the case of the medical personnel. Our nurses, something like 80% of Lesotho nurses have left the country. A similar number of doctors. Last year in Britain, there were no less than 43 Lesotho nurses who were registered with the British Nursing Council, enough to staff 2 hospitals. And we've only got 18 hospitals in the country. That happens every year. We'll have no nurses at all. There's no shortage of girls and indeed boys in schools who want to become nurses. But we are lacking training facilities. We're lacking some of the school subjects such as science and mathematics and English, which are needed by people to enter the nursing colleges. We think very strongly that the nations who are taking the nurses, that is South Africa, Canada, Britain, even the United States and Australia, should be helping us to pay for more nurses to be trained. Amongst all the uncertainties and change, we've been very unfortunate to have each other, which I think has been the best of our decisions that we made here. We're very grateful also to our friends, our colleagues, all our associates, from the village right up to the members of the government, who have made our stay here interesting, challenging, and certainly never something with which we were bored. We've been very grateful to participate in some small way in the development of Lesotho over these past 40 years. As we leave you, we think of the future generations of students and staff who will work in these same pleasant surroundings. We wish them good fortune in meeting the very many challenges which life in Lesotho presents, and we hope that they will respond and actually manage to overcome some of these challenges.
As we leave, we look back on our life here, and there have been many challenges and many occasions coming our way. Sometimes I wished I had done it differently, but on the whole, it worked out in a harmonious way, and we will take memories of this harmonious life with us.
We hope that what we've produced in this film will include items of interest to you, and in some way that we've been able to share our lives with you. And as we leave you also, we think of others who've made contributions which we haven't documented in much detail here. In particular in Roma, it's the Catholic missionaries. And the music which we're going to play as the film ends will be from a CD-ROM which has been recently re-recorded by a friend of ours, Karen Getzel. It's music originally performed for the visit of the Pope in 1988. And the words of the hymn are Etsetsang modimo di tladzi, lorna mafadzi orthle. More or less, all people that on earth do dwell, sing to the Lord with cheerful voice.